Welcome to Hot Boys Garage, episode 25.
This is the fourth and final video in the four-part series that's all about a 2006 Honda TRX450R engine with a new build combination. In this video, we're going to cover a variety of things.
What?
From piston to oil squirter clearance, to ring clocking, cylinder honing, piston installation, and more. Most of this is going to be specific to the 2006 Honda TRX450R engine, but some of it will be applicable to other engine types too.
So let's jump into it.
Now we're going to perform a clearance check on something that's specific to the 2006 and up Honda TRX450R engines, or any engine that has a protruding oil squirter like this, in which you're going to use a larger than stock piston. You've got to make sure the undercrown of the piston is going to clear this by at least 20 thousandths or more. So to perform this check, you're going to need the left crankcase with the main crank bearing installed, the oil squirter installed. Make sure you use locking agent on this bolt, torque it to 7 foot-pounds, and the head studs on this side of the case will also need to be installed. You'll also need some modeling clay, the piston, top compression ring, piston pin, one of the piston circlips, the cylinder, the crankshaft, a Sharpie to mark the piston, a flat screwdriver or something similar to help you install the circlip into the piston, and some engine oil for lubrication. We'll need to take our piston and determine which way is front and back. Now, sometimes stock or aftermarket pistons will have an arrow pointing forward to show you the direction the piston goes in. That arrow is always going to point to the front of the bike, or if you flip it over, sometimes it'll say intake or exhaust or IN or EX for exhaust, and that'll help you determine what's front or back. But if your piston's like this one and has no markings, you can take a quick look at the valve reliefs and notice how these valve reliefs are much wider. 99% of the time, those wider valve reliefs are going to be for the larger intake valves. So the side with the larger reliefs is going to go towards the rear of the engine or the intake side, and the side with the smaller valve reliefs is going to go towards the front of the engine or the exhaust side. And if you're unsure, you can grab a set of calipers, measure the width of these valve reliefs, and that should pretty easily tell the story for which side is the intake and which side is the exhaust. Now, once you've determined the orientation of the piston, you can compare it to the left side case and install the circlip on the far or left side in the piston pin bore. So we're going to go ahead and install just that one side circlip using a small screwdriver. All right, installing these circlips can be kind of tricky. So what I usually do is put the pin in from the back and bring it right up next to where the circlip recess is. That way it kind of gives me a backing for the circlip. That way I don't push it past the recess in there. And then I'll start it with my fingers. And then you have to be really careful with these things because they are pretty springy. You go to start pushing on this with a screwdriver, and the screwdriver or whatever tool you're using to push this in slips off of it. These things will go flying across your shop or garage. So I was able to walk this thing in with a larger flat screwdriver. And now with my smaller flat screwdriver, I'll push it the rest of the way in, and you can hear it seat in that recess. Now we'll take the piston and put a light coat of oil on it, and the cylinder, put a light coat of oil on it. Then we'll take our compression ring, put it in the correct top ringland on the piston, and we'll put the piston into the bore of the cylinder. Next, we'll put a light coat of oil down here on the crankshaft and on the crank bearing, and slip the crank into the left case. And make sure it's seated all the way. Now we can rotate the rod all the way down to the bottom so that we've got room to put our piston and cylinder down over the studs. Now we'll take our piston pin with a little bit of lube on it, align the small end of the rod with the piston pin bore, slip the pin all the way through, and then bring our cylinder all the way down to where it's setting flush on top of the case. Now usually I would have already had a chunk of modeling clay sitting on top of that oil squirter so we could check for clearance. But with this particular build combo, I already know that the piston in its stock form is not going to clear the oil squirter at all. And let me shine a flashlight in here so that you can see when I rotate the engine over, you can see the piston coming down, and it hits that oil squirter and stops completely. It will not rotate any further. So now while the piston's down there on the oil squirter, I'm going to mark with a Sharpie where I need to clearance the underside of the piston. And then we can take it back apart, and we can see exactly where we need to start clearancing the underside of this piston. Hopefully your piston has plenty of clearance between the undercrown and the piston squirter, but if not, you'll need a tool, something like these, to start cutting it down. Now my preferred method is a little angle grinder with a flap disc attached. You could also use a carbide burr, something like this, but I would caution you using something like this at high RPM. It can get away from you pretty quickly, and you could end up nicking a part of your piston that you didn't really want to cut on. And if you wanted to get real aggressive, you could pull out a big angle grinder like this this with a flap disc and go to town. But first, you'll need to remove your compression ring from the piston and then start clearancing. Just like with everything else, I'd recommend going slow, removing a little bit of material at a time, reinstalling everything, and rechecking to see if the piston's going to clear. Or if you've got the means and the know-how, you could potentially remove this protruding oil squirter and install like a smaller fixed jet. I haven't found a way to do that yet and verify that it's actually going to squirt on the part of the piston and rod that I'm going to need it to. So the easiest and most foolproof method I've found is just clearancing the bottom of the piston crown. Now with the piston clearance, I've put a decent chunk of oil here on top of the piston oil squirter, and then I put a little bit of oil on top of it to keep the clay from wanting to stick to the bottom of the piston. And now I can reassemble and roll the piston through. Hopefully this is going to show up on camera. I'm just holding the cylinder down with my left hand and rotating the crank around and bringing the piston down with my right hand. And once you've done that and made a mark in the clay, you can pull it back apart and measure your clearance with calipers. Something else that you can visually inspect or measure whenever the engine's mocked up like this is how far the skirts of the piston come out of the cylinder skirts. And you can do that by marking it with a Sharpie and then inspecting that whenever you pull it back apart just to see how far the piston comes out of the skirts. One more thing you can check out is how close the crank webs come to the piston itself. Now with this engine, just with a quick visual inspection, you can see that there's a pretty large gap here. You can measure it with feeler gauges. This is over 60 thousandths and it goes with plenty of play. But if this is too close, you may need to machine the bottom of the piston here at the wrist pin bore, which I really wouldn't recommend. Ideally, you'd want to machine the bottom of the crank webs to provide the clearance there. So let's pull it back apart and check it out. Now with everything back apart, I went ahead and cut the clay with a razor blade. That way with calipers, I can measure and see what my actual piston to oil squirter clearance is. And we've got plenty all the way around. And again, for this, you want at least 20 thousandths or more. So we'll pull this clay off and go on to the next. Coming back to our piston, we can measure how far the piston comes out of the bottom of the cylinder. And this one comes in right at about 1/4 of an inch, just under, which really isn't bad. You really just don't want to have the piston come so far out that you're anywhere close to the oil ring land coming out of the bottom. On a brand new combination, that's important to check. With this one, we're going to be good to go. And while we've got our piston here, you can see the top of it, nice new shiny machine finish. Now what I like to do is there's these sharp edges right here all around the valve reliefs on both sides. I don't like to leave those sharp edges. I'll take a small piece of 320 grit sandpaper and knock those sharp edges off. Because what could happen is those sharp edges can cause hot spots in the combustion chamber. And then finally, after all this, remember to clean the piston out really well. I usually use some electrical contact cleaner, spray everything out, spray all the gas ports out, spray the pin bore out, blow it all out with air, because everything that we're doing as far as removing material from the piston and sanding down these sharp edges, that creates a whole lot of small little fine particles, and you don't want that going through your brand new top end. Another step I like to take is take one of these flex ball hones, chuck it up in my hand drill, lube both the hone and the cylinder with either oil or kerosene or diesel fuel, and give it a quick hone to deglaze it. And I'll even do this for brand new cylinders, especially after I've had the rings in and out a bunch of times trying to measure and set ring end gap. It's just a quick little thing to do that gives me peace of mind to make sure that that cylinder is deglazed and has a nice consistent smooth surface. And this is the flex hone that I use. It's 320 grit, 105 millimeter. I've used this on cylinders as small as 94 millimeter and as large as 105 millimeter, and it works great. Next step is to install the piston rings for the last time, hopefully. I start by giving the piston a light coat of oil all the way around, as well as giving the rings a nice light coat of oil. I like to install the oil expander ring first. It goes in this bottom ringland. Then I'll install the bottom oil ring, which also goes in the bottom ringland, directly under the oil expander ring. Then I'll install the top oil ring, which goes in the same ringland, directly above the oil expander ring, like so. Then you can install your compression ring or rings. And remember, these usually are directional. If they are, they'll have a dot or a laser mark on the top face. If there is no mark, you want to look for an inner bevel. Whichever side has the inner bevel, that side's going to be up. Now, as far as clocking rings, I don't spend a whole lot of time messing with this. I usually make sure my compression ring starts out on one side that's not loaded. That is, it's not to the front or to the back. It's either to this side or this side. And then I make sure the gap on my oil rings is offset, at least by about 25 degrees or so. As the engine runs, the piston moves up and down, these rings do spin around, and that's why I don't take a huge amount of time clocking rings. Really, you just want to make sure that all the ring end gaps are staggered apart and they don't all line up whenever you first install it. A tip for installing the piston into the cylinder: lube both the cylinder and the piston up with oil. Remember to pay attention to which way you install the piston. You want the larger valve reliefs towards the back of the engine. That'll be for the intakes, and the smaller valve reliefs will be towards the front of the engine for the exhaust. Something that I like to do for a brand new piston with a brand new set of rings, sometimes they're a little harder to get into the cylinder, so I'll flip the cylinder over, flip the piston over, and I'll use gravity to help me gently persuade the piston and rings down into the cylinder. Compression ring is usually easy to get started, but you want to be very careful and go very slow in getting your oil rings to go down into the cylinder, because you do not want to fold one of these over. Again, they're made of a lot flimsier material. You just want to use your hands to help squeeze them together and gently work them around. Just be patient, go slow. And then what's kind of nice about these aftermarket cylinders for an 06 and up TRX, they've got this little cutout here. Before you send this piston all the way home, you can use this as kind of like a little window to check and make sure your oil rings are looking good. All right, last tip. When installing your piston and cylinder, if you installed your piston into your cylinder first, and then you're going to slip it down on here and put the pin through, before you go to insert that last circlip into the piston, make sure you stuff this area full of clean rags or paper towels, because if that circlip falls down inside the engine here, you'll likely have to split the cases back apart to get it.
That's it for that episode.
Make sure you check out the other episodes in this video series. Episode 1 covers rough initial measurements and a cylinder fitment check. Episode 2 covers how to measure your piston to cylinder wall clearance. And episode 3 covers how to measure and set your piston ring end gaps. Direct links to all those videos will be in this video's description.
Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Thanks for watching. Alright guys, that's it.